Tuesday morning, 20 Chinese oil tankers entered the Strait of Hormuz. Armed Chinese Coast Guard cutters escort them. The USS Arleigh Burke has positioned in a box formation to intercept. The convoy has not stopped. The U.S. Navy has not fired. Wednesday morning, right now, both are still there. Documents from CENTCOM operational updates show the destroyer activated weapon systems at 0430 hours local time yesterday. That is not a patrol posture. That is an engagement posture. The tankers are 12 nautical miles from Iranian oil terminals. Neither side is blinking. If you have been following the escalation in the Persian Gulf since the sanctions regime tightened in March, you know this was not supposed to happen. The assumption across every strategic analysis was that Beijing would probe, test, and maneuver, but never commit this openly. That assumption died Tuesday. What most coverage is treating as a naval standoff is actually a threshold crossing. This is the first time since 1945 that one nuclear-armed power has deployed military assets to directly break another nuclear-armed power's blockade in an active conflict zone. The fact that it is happening in the narrowest choke point for global energy changes what comes next. What is at stake is not just this convoy or this week. What is at stake is whether the international order operates on diplomatic agreements or on whoever is willing to put steel in the water and hold position. If you want to understand not just the standoff, but the mechanism that made it inevitable, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Let us go through this completely. Let us start with the USS Arleigh Burke operational logs, because they are the foundation of everything that follows. The destroyer moved into box formation, 4-point positioning designed to maximize firing solutions on multiple targets simultaneously, at 0430 local time on May 5. CENTCOM does not activate that formation for observation. CENTCOM activates that formation when the rules of engagement authorize lethal force and the tactical situation requires the capability to execute it immediately. The language in the update circulated to Allied naval commands uses the phrase, "maintain intercept posture until further notice." That phrasing has appeared in exactly 3 previous incidents in the last decade. All 3 involved weapons release authorization. The box formation is not a warning. The box formation is the final step before engagement. The second piece, Chinese Coast Guard cutter tactical radio intercepts confirm orders described as escort to completion. The intercepts were verified through signals intelligence shared with Gulf Cooperation Council partners and later corroborated in classified briefings to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Escort to completion is not escort to the edge of contested waters. Escort to completion means escort to the Iranian oil terminals. The orders originated from Eastern Theater Command, which does not issue directives for routine Coast Guard operations. When Eastern Theater Command issues the order, it means the operation has been elevated to a strategic military priority with direct authorization from the Central Military Commission. That is the body that answers only to Xi Jinping. This is not a rogue Coast Guard captain making an aggressive decision in the moment. This is a decision made in Beijing with full understanding of what it forces. The scale of the convoy is the third piece, and it closes the argument. 20 tankers, total estimated capacity, 18.2 million barrels of crude oil. That is equivalent to 3 full days of Chinese petroleum imports under current consumption rates. Cross-referenced against shipping manifests and historical Iranian export patterns, the convoy represents the largest single oil movement from Iran to China since sanctions were reimposed. The convoy is not symbolic. The convoy is not a probe. The convoy is an operational supply mission executed with the expectation that it will succeed. Beijing committed naval assets to ensure success because losing the convoy, either to U.S. interdiction or to a strategic backdown, would be a larger setback than the risk of confrontation. That calculation tells you everything about where Beijing thinks the leverage is. But understanding the tankers and the destroyers is only half of the picture. What the coverage is missing completely is that the confrontation is not about oil. The confrontation is about whether the United States will enforce a blockade when enforcement means firing on a nuclear pier. Here is the framework. When a nuclear power commits naval assets to break another nuclear power's blockade, watch what they protect more than what they say. Beijing is not protecting 20 tankers. Beijing is protecting the global perception that American red lines are negotiable if you are willing to call them. That framework explains why this is happening now. The sanctions regime has been in place for 2 months. Tankers have tried to run it before. The difference is that none of those tankers had Chinese Coast Guard cutters escorting them. None of those tankers had orders originating from Eastern Theater Command. Beijing waited until they had read the U.S. response pattern to every prior interdiction, and then they committed assets in a way that forces the U.S. to either shoot or step aside. There is no third option that preserves both the blockade and the avoidance of direct confrontation. Now, here is the part most coverage skipped. The framework applies to every other contested space where the U.S. has drawn a line and Beijing is deciding whether to test it. The South China Sea, Taiwan, the semiconductor export controls. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz in the next 72 hours tells Xi Jinping whether the cost of crossing a U.S. red line is actual military confrontation or a strongly worded condemnation followed by quiet acceptance. If the USS Arleigh Burke breaks radar lock and allows the convoy through, every other red line gets tested within 6 months. If the USS Arleigh Burke maintains position and fires, even a warning shot, the calculus changes entirely. Beijing then has to decide whether this specific convoy is worth the escalation ladder that a kinetic exchange initiates. But the decision matrix is binary. There is no version where the U.S. maintains the blockade and Beijing backs down without losing face. That is why the convoy has not turned around. That is why the destroyer has not moved. The framework gives you the tool to read every development from this point forward. When you see diplomatic language about restraint and dialogue, check whether the ships have moved. If they have not moved, the diplomacy is theater. When you see reporting about back channels and off-ramps, check whether Beijing has used the phrase core interests in official statements. If they have, the back channels are not producing an exit. The phrase core interests in Chinese diplomatic language means the issue is non-negotiable and retreat is not an option. Watch the language, watch the ships. Everything else is commentary. The mechanism explains the current posture, what it forces, what it means for the decisions both sides make in the next 48 hours, is where this gets serious. If this analysis is giving you what the daily coverage is missing, subscribe to this channel right now. Share this with someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening. Let us keep going. The closest historical parallel is not the Taiwan Strait crises of 1995 or 1996. It is the Cuban Missile Crisis naval quarantine, October 1962. President Kennedy declared a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent Soviet missiles from reaching the island. Soviet freighters carrying the missiles continued toward the quarantine line. U.S. destroyers positioned to intercept. For 36 hours, the world waited to see if Soviet ships would stop or if U.S. ships would fire. The mechanism was identical. One nuclear power enforcing a blockade, another nuclear power testing whether enforcement meant actual confrontation. The Soviet freighters stopped short of the quarantine line. Khrushchev chose strategic retreat over kinetic engagement. The crisis de-escalated because one side blinked. The parallel is not that Beijing will blink the way Moscow did. The parallel is the decision structure. Both situations create a binary choice under time pressure, with no middle option that satisfies both sides. In 1962, the variable that favored the U.S. was Soviet understanding that American political tolerance for confrontation in the Western Hemisphere was absolute. The Monroe Doctrine was not negotiable. Khrushchev tested it and confirmed it was real. In 2026, the variable that Beijing is testing is whether American political tolerance for confrontation in the Persian Gulf, 7,000 miles from the U.S. mainland, in a region where U.S. public support for military engagement has collapsed, is still absolute. Beijing is betting it is not. What is different now is that the U.S. is not enforcing a blockade in its own hemisphere. The U.S. is enforcing a blockade in a region where China has spent 15 years building dependencies, infrastructure, and the perception that it is the ascendant power. The other difference? In 1962, the confrontation was about preventing a change to the status quo. In 2026, the confrontation is about enforcing a change to the status quo. Preventing change is easier than imposing it. The side trying to impose change has to demonstrate will at every stage. The side resisting change only has to demonstrate will once. That asymmetry favors Beijing in this scenario in a way it favored Washington in 1962. Let us step back from the specific convoy and look at what this means for the larger trajectory. Here is what happens if both sides find a diplomatic off-ramp that allows them to claim victory without escalation. In the next 48 hours, back channels between Washington and Beijing produce a formula. The U.S. agrees to allow the convoy through under a humanitarian exception. The oil is reclassified as essential civilian supply rather than sanctions violation. China agrees to reroute the tankers to a neutral third-party port where the oil is inspected and released through a multilateral process that gives the U.S. plausible cover. Both sides withdraw naval assets simultaneously under a deconfliction protocol. Beijing tells its domestic audience that it broke the blockade and forced American concessions. Washington tells Congress that it maintained the sanctions regime while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. The convoy delivers its oil through a longer route, and the immediate crisis ends. In 2 to 4 weeks, the formula becomes the new baseline. Every future convoy uses the same humanitarian exception language. The sanctions regime remains on paper, but enforcement becomes negotiable. U.S. allies in the Gulf Cooperation Council see the exception and begin making their own accommodations with Beijing, because the lesson is that confronting China leads to American retreat. Iran gains effective sanctions relief without any formal agreement, because China has demonstrated it can move oil regardless of U.S. policy. The strategic cost to Washington is not the oil. The strategic cost is that every other nation watching the standoff now knows that U.S. red lines are subject to revision under pressure. 6 to 12 months from now, the pattern repeats in the South China Sea. Beijing applies the same model. Commit assets, force a binary choice, and wait for Washington to find a face-saving retreat. The semiconductor export controls collapse under the same mechanism. U.S. partners in the Indo-Pacific begin their own hedging strategies because the risk of aligning with Washington is that Washington finds an off-ramp when the confrontation gets real. The world that emerges from this scenario is one where American security guarantees are provisional, and Beijing has established that it can break U.S. policy through committed escalation. The blockade ends quietly. The world order changes loudly. Here's what happens if the standoff hardens into kinetic exchange. The USS Arleigh Burke maintains intercept posture. The Chinese convoy continues toward Iranian waters. At some point in the next 48 hours, most likely in the pre-dawn hours when visibility is lowest and both sides' defensive postures are at maximum readiness, one side makes a move the other interprets as hostile. The most likely trigger: a Chinese Coast Guard cutter moves between the destroyer and the tankers in a blocking maneuver. The destroyer fires a warning shot across the cutter's bow. The cutter does not alter course. The second shot is not a warning. One Chinese Coast Guard cutter is hit. Casualties are sustained. The convoy scatters. One tanker attempting evasive maneuvers in crowded waters suffers damage, either from U.S. fire or from collision. Oil spills into the strait. In 2 to 4 weeks, the immediate tactical situation is frozen, but the strategic situation is in freefall. China suspends all military-to-military communication with the United States and recalls its ambassador. The UN Security Council convenes in emergency session. China and Russia veto every resolution. The oil markets, already fragile, experience a complete halt in Strait of Hormuz traffic as insurers refuse to cover any transit. Global crude prices double. The U.S. releases strategic petroleum reserves to prevent domestic economic collapse, but the release is a short-term measure that depletes the buffer for future crises. Beijing begins massive naval deployments to the South China Sea, explicitly framing them as defensive measures against American aggression. U.S. allies in Europe fracture. Some support the American position, others openly call for de-escalation and blame Washington for the confrontation. 6 to 12 months from now, the world has divided into 2 security blocks in a way not seen since the Cold War. China has fully committed to Iran, Russia, and every other state willing to oppose the U.S.-led order. Trade routes fracture along geopolitical lines. The global economy enters a prolonged recession as supply chains that depend on open sea lanes collapse. The U.S. maintains the blockade, but the cost of enforcement, economically, diplomatically, and militarily, is unsustainable. The question is no longer whether the U.S. can enforce its will in the Persian Gulf. The question is whether the U.S. can maintain alliance structures when enforcement produces this level of global instability. The tanker is stopped. The order that depended on American dominance of the seas is broken. We are tracking every dimension of this here on this channel. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. The mainstream tells you what happened today. We tell you what it means for tomorrow. The mechanism is now visible. The standoff is not about one convoy. The standoff is about whether international order runs on agreements or on the willingness to enforce them with violence. China just chose oil over peace, and they did it in broad daylight. That single decision to escort the convoy with military assets and dare the U.S. to fire is the threshold. Everything before this moment was maneuvering. Everything after this moment is consequence. The framework from earlier applies perfectly here. Watch what they protect more than what they say. Beijing protected the principle that U.S. blockades are optional if you are willing to challenge them. That principle, once established, applies everywhere. The Strait of Hormuz is the test case. The South China Sea is next. Taiwan is after that. What happens in the next 72 hours determines whether Beijing's calculation was correct. The question that all of this leads to, and that the next 2 weeks will force an answer to, is whether the United States will pull the trigger when the target is a nuclear peer. In the next 48 hours, Watch whether the USS Arleigh Burke maintains weapons lock or breaks radar contact. If the destroyer maintains lock through Thursday evening local time, the U.S. is committed to enforcement and has accepted the risk of engagement. If the destroyer breaks lock, Washington has made the decision to find a diplomatic solution, and Beijing has won the test. Both outcomes tell you something definitive. One tells you the U.S. is willing to fight for the blockade. The other tells you the blockade was never worth fighting for. In the next week, watch whether the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs uses the phrase core interests in any official statement about the standoff. If that phrase appears by May 13, Beijing has internally decided that retreat is not an option, and that the convoy will reach Iranian terminals regardless of U.S. actions. The phrase core interests in Chinese diplomatic doctrine means the issue has been elevated to the same category as Taiwan and Tibet, non-negotiable sovereignty questions where compromise is treated as national humiliation. If the phrase does not appear, back channels are still producing potential off-ramps, and Beijing has not fully committed to confrontation. In the next month, watch whether insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London suspend coverage for all Strait of Hormuz transits. If coverage is suspended by June 5, the private sector has made the assessment that the risk of kinetic engagement is high enough that no commercial traffic can operate in the strait, regardless of what governments say. That suspension would force a global energy crisis, even without a shot being fired, because 30% of the world's seaborne oil moves through that choke point. The insurance decision will tell you whether the market believes this standoff ends or whether this standoff is the new normal. When the first of those signals resolves, and the earliest could come by tomorrow night, the analysis will be here. Not a summary, not a headline repeat. Evidence, assessment. What it means for the trajectory, in that order. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This is not coverage that tells you both sides want de-escalation and hope prevails. This is coverage that tracks what both sides are actually doing and what those actions force. The difference matters when the stakes are this high. The mainstream coverage will tell you that cooler heads will prevail, that back channels are working, that no one wants a war. That analysis assumes rational de-escalation is always possible. The evidence shows something different. The evidence shows that Beijing has committed to a course of action that only succeeds if Washington retreats, and Washington is committed to a posture that only succeeds if Beijing retreats. Both cannot be right. The next development will show which one miscalculated. That development is coming in hours, not weeks. We will be here to break it down the moment it happens. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always. We will see you in the next. This is the channel.